Ready to learn, ready to learn. A lot of you are already back to school. A lot of people are learning. We're gonna learn together. Hey, I'm really excited, especially if we haven't met, or maybe, it's back to school, back to the fall, back to like regular life, and you're visiting again, or you're back from vacation, or whatever is the case. Maybe you just trickled in by mistake, you got lost, you're here. We're just so happy you're here. And it's a great morning to be here because we're learning together and exploring really what it means to believe in God in a different way. And I know a lot of people, you ask them, they believe in God, they read the Bible, are they Christians? I mean, we live in a culture, especially here in Quebec, many of you know this, that people have so many different views about this. They have different ideas and different approaches. And so at the 180, one of the things we really try to do, you heard it in the video, is the vision of the church is really to help people love Jesus and to help them love like Jesus. I mean, if we can hold that together and model that, I think people will be open to saying, you know what, I never understood God that way. I don't think I really ever saw that in the Bible before. So if you're here and you feel like maybe like this is new to you, we're just happy you're here. We want you to feel welcome. And so to begin this morning, I just want to ask you a question. I'm just curious, how many of you would say that you recognize one of the characters on the screen behind me? You can put your hand up when you do, okay? Look at the screen behind me. You recognize one of these characters. Hands up if you do. Any of you? Yeah? Some of you? Some of you, no hands up at all. I thought like if I could see your hands, it's gonna give me a sense of how old the crowd is. I'll get a sense. I'm like, we got an old church if you just know that guy. Okay, one of the characters is a special character kind of in the Pink Panther trilogy, Pink Panther story. And another one obviously is Mr. Bean. And the reason I show you this, many people, whether they're religious or not, or believe in God, they kind of know some of these characters, and they represent kind of the height of a form of comedy, which is like almost like they solve crimes by mistake. Right? It's like you watch it and you're like, there's a bomb gonna go off, the whole world is gonna explode, and Mr. Bean spills coffee and it all stops, and you're like, wow, it's all came together, right? It's a genre of watching movies that's called a comedy. You know why it's called a comedy? Because all of us know life doesn't happen that way. It's like a joke. All of us know that life, we don't just unintentionally fall into a better marriage. We don't unintentionally just solve the world's problems. We don't just unintentionally just find joy by mistake. Actually, the lives that we're really called to live and the lives we know we're called to live require for us to be intentional about how we think about life, how we think about ourselves, how we think about God, how we think about what it means to be parents. And so many people that I meet, as a pastor, I'm with them, I pray with them, journey with them. It's just over time you start to feel like life is just gonna work itself out. And we have sayings for this. If you don't believe, if it's meant to be, you know what, it'll happen. Like all these nice sayings, they sound nice, it's great to tweet them, but they're lies. Because we know it's just not true. Like for almost everything in our life, we have to slow down and be intentional. If you have students who started school this week, you're gonna try to teach them that, right? You're gonna be like, listen, I need to see your agenda. I need to know that you're intentionally gonna prepare and study, like we do that. And then after that, we go into our life and we just hope everything just falls into place. The truth is that God invites us to be open to the fact that our lives fit an intentional story. A story that He's weaving through us. And not only that our lives fit that story, but that God Himself has an intentional way that He deals with us as humans. This is one of the great, beautiful things about Christianity, is that God's like, this is not just kind of all made up. And we often say this at times to people like that you're here this morning for us. It's not just a mistake. It's not just that you squeezed in some time. So we actually think it's an intentional part of how God wants to speak to you this morning. And you know why this is so important? Because when we don't live intentional lives, we live in a world where we just go with the flow of what's happening. Like somebody posts something, you just believe it. Somebody says something, you're like, I think that's true for now, until next week, until there's a new idea. But we just get lost in all of this stuff. And I read a great quote years ago by an important Christian thinker. This is what he says. It's G.K. Chesterton. You can put it on the screen. This is what he says with the quote. You go to the next slide. He says, a dead thing can go with the stream, but only a living thing can go against it. This is the truth about life as well. Like if you just live like just in the flow of like whatever, it's obviously not that you're dead, really dead, but something inside of you has stopped being intentional about the way you live, the way you think about your life, the way you talk about who you are with your kids. At some point you'll realize really the only power you really have is just to go with the flow. Whatever everybody else is doing. And in our culture, this is a strange phenomenon that many people notice in different ways. For example, do you know how many people read something online and just share it without even reading it? The studies are staggering, like that people see stuff and they just share it. They don't even know what's going on. We have this triggered culture where we're just like, I don't have the energy to have to intentionally think about this. I'm just too tired to really care about slowing down to maybe learn. I don't want to deal with my kids. Just give them a tablet. I don't care, play with whatever. And after a while we realize all those things can be good things. I mean, I'm not against tablets, I'm not against them. They can be good things. But if they're used as distractions and things that disconnect us from living intentional lives, we slowly start to feel like something in us is dying, and God's saying, you know what, like I've created you to be alive and to be aware of what I want to do in your life. To not believe just the stories that you hear in the world about who you are and how things work, but to intentionally think about, God, what is it that you're actually doing? What is it that you're actually trying to say to me? Like, are you even real? Is there a God out there anywhere? And so one of the things I'm praying for us in this series, as we begin this series, is every week, as we go through this series, we're going to do two really important things, okay? One is, we're going to help you to see the kinds of stories you believe that are not true. We're just going to help you to see, I'm going to do one this morning, just in a few minutes, I'm going to show you that we believe a certain story of life, and eventually we realize, if we're not really intentional about it, we believe it, and we realize, well, I don't think that's true, but I've believed in that my whole life. We're going to do that, and we're going to do it by just showing you something really, really special. I want you to take just 30 seconds. If you're listening to this on a podcast, too bad, you have to be here to see this, okay? I want you to all turn around, and look at that wall behind you. Everybody turn around, look at the people in the back. Wall behind you. You also see the people who like to sit in the back, so it's just, okay? These are 5 paintings that now are they belong to the 180, and the long story is there's an artist who painted these paintings years ago that I was part of a church I was a part of, and the church wasn't sure if they were going to keep them, and we just took the paintings, and each of these paintings represents a pivotal moment in the story of God where he intentionally enters the moments of his people and says, listen, never forget that what I'm doing is very intentional. Never forget that what I'm about to do now is going to teach you something about who I am and who you are. And so there's these 5 panels, and what we're going to do every week, starting this week, is I'm going to preach, myself, Pastor Mateo, we're going to preach on each panel individually. And our prayer for you is that every time you see them, and every time you kind of, walk by them, and you'll be able to say, like, this is kind of the pillar points, the anchoring points of which the story of our faith kind of connects to. The thing I think of is like a fence. You know when you put up a fence at your house, you need like the posts? The posts are like the markers. Like if you pull out the post, no matter how nice the fence is, it's going to fall. Right? So these are kind of like pillar points. And obviously there's some of you like, well, there should be 37 pillars. I know, relax. Okay? We thought these 5, some people already sending emails while I'm talking. Okay, these 5, we're going to help you. Easy to remember, 5 kind of pillar points, markers, where you would be like, God, you were intentionally teaching your people something here that I need to learn still today. God, in this season, you were intentionally teaching your people something here that we still need to think about today. And so we've called this series intentional, and we wanted you to feel what it's like to see your life in the story that God is weaving and feel for the first time maybe that God has a place for you in that story. Now I want to tell you how easy it is for us to believe other stories. All of us face this temptation because we live in a world where people are telling us all kinds of other things, and God's always telling his people, hey, remember, like, I know you think that's true, but it's not. Like, this is where you belong, and this is the story, right? One of the most popular stories about who we are, that we all believe, is that you are what you own. Okay? This happens very, very subtly, right? You kind of think, oh no, I don't care, but after a while, one of the great stories of marketing in our world is your value is based on what you buy and what you own. Just think about it. It doesn't even happen intentionally. Like you just almost fall into that. And you're like, wow, I better get that, I better get this. And you really feel it when there's younger people in your life because they easily start to believe that because they start to put pressure on mom and dad or grandparents, right? I need to have those shoes and I don't have a Nintendo Switch and I don't, right? And you're trying to tell them, listen, we love you. You don't really need those things to really figure out who you are. And we say that to them, but it doesn't really stick, right? So they kind of, if I don't have those things, I'm not going to fit in. This is such a serious story that we believe that schools have uniforms. Uniforms are the world's way of dealing with the fact that we don't want kids to feel pressure if somebody's wearing Prada and someone's wearing Gucci and someone's wearing nothing, right? Not nothing, but you know what I mean. So let's kind of just bring that whole story down and make everybody wear uniforms so we can't tell. Let's do that. That's a story we all live in. And at some point, we're going to have to tell ourselves, listen, do I believe that story about myself? Do I believe that somehow I have to keep producing and buying and showing other people that I'm more successful than them, even if I like them? It's just, do I do that? Because if you believe that story, it will be so hard for you to worship God with your money. It will be almost impossible to do that. And God's like, listen, if you have the wrong story for who you are and how you have value, this is never going to work. So God's like, I need to give you a different story to live in. And I want to tell you about how subtle this happens. Every week as we talk to you, I'm going to try to explain to you, here's a story that you're given in the culture. And you're like, yeah, I don't know how I started to believe that, but I kind of started to believe that. You know, when I was younger and I started going to church, I had a weird church experience is I started going to church in a weird way. I was raised Roman Catholic. My mom started going to Pentecostal church, and I was like, what is this? This is kind of weird. Maybe you know some of those experiences, right? Somebody in your family's like found Jesus, and they're kooky, and you're like, I don't know what to do with them now, and they're buying flags if they're Pentecostals. Pentecostals sometimes have flags. We love you anyway. You can come here, but I'm just saying, tone it down with the flags. So, we have all kinds of things that we do, right? So Christians are trying to figure out how do we worship, this is how we worship, and all these things. And one of the things that was often said to me when I was growing up is that, when you say yes to Jesus, he has a purpose for your life. How many of you have ever heard that? How many of you have ever said that? Right? And when people tell you that, what they're trying to help you feel is a sense of hope. They're trying to help you feel like a sense that your life is not just a mistake. But I want to tell you that when we hear that over a long period of time, we start to believe another myth and another story that's not true. I'm going to tell you this. If you're into notes, you're watching this, you write this down. God does not have a purpose for your life. Okay, some of you are like, oh my gosh, he's a heretic. He's a heretic up there. God doesn't even care about the purpose you have for your life. God cares about the purpose he has for your life. You see the difference? That after a while, we start to believe the story, the wrong story, that now God exists to help me find my purpose for myself. And when you start to read the Bible and you start to understand the scriptures and you start to see how Jesus lives and acts, you start to realize, wait a second, I don't think God really cares about my destiny. I'm like, listen, you don't have to pray about that, he doesn't. He cares about how you fit into his story. And when that happens and you're not ready for it, you're like, wait a second, I don't even know if I want to believe in a God that has that. I want to believe in God who cares about my purpose for my life. And throughout our lives, God's saying, listen, I have great plans for you, and don't get me wrong, and don't send me emails. I don't mean that God doesn't really care about the purposes of our lives. But I mean that if those purposes don't fit his purposes for your life, they really don't matter. Don't even pray about them. They don't. And so this morning, I want to help you begin to open your heart and say, God, what really is your purpose for my life? What's the things you're calling me to that's going to change who I am and how I feel? You know how hard it is to teach this to kids? You know how hard it is to teach them to listen, hey, we love you. Maybe your parents here, you know this, you're praying for your kids from when they're young, they're going to school. And this is instinctual as parents. We start to develop all the things we want our kids to be, right? Oh, I hope they're lawyers. I hope they're an astronaut. I hope they're a YouTuber. I hope my kids are famous gamers, whatever. Make a lot of money. So all of these ideas, right? We have all these purposes. How many of you, be honest, you don't have to put your hand down. How many of you look at your kids, I'm like, man, I hope God calls you to ministry. How many of you prayed that prayer for your kids? Man, I hope God's purpose for you is that he's called you to serve him in the life of the church, to be a kingdom builder. How many have done that? No, it's not even in your purpose framework. My parents never prayed that for me. They were busy preparing me for the purpose they had for me in their head. And God's like, imagine when I said to them, hey, I think mom and dad, it was a painful one. It's a whole nother sermon. But I was like, I think the purpose that God might be calling me into is to serve him in a church. And there was no words for that. Like, you want to be a priest? What is that? Do they make money? Are priests poor? Do you have to move? Like, oh my God, I don't know. Kids, young adults, youth, the most difficult decision of your life will be when you have to tell your parents that they have the wrong purpose for your life, that God's giving you a new purpose. It's going to be the most difficult decision of your life. When you're like, listen, I know you love me. I know that's great, but that's not what I'm doing with my life. I'm doing something else. That's when we start to realize that we belong to a story that's God's story, not God's there for our story. See the difference? And if this bothers you and if this hurts you, you're going to hate Jesus. You're going to hate Christianity. You're going to hate everything about it because that's what he's always doing to people. They're fishing. They're doing stuff and God's like, this is great, but this is not the plan God has for you. Quit that and follow me. Right? But aren't you going to be the God who helps us be great fishermen and be rich? Nope. You're not fishing anymore. You're going to do this now. Can you start to pray that way for your life? Can you start to say, God, I don't even know what it looks like to begin to just ask you to give me a fresh purpose that's rooted in your story. So this morning what I want to do is I want to begin by showing you how this happens in the first panel. Okay, the first panel, you can look behind if you want to see the panel. The first panel behind there is a panel that we'll call the creating God. It's like, you can use like the living God, creation. It's meant to capture the beginning of the story where God says, watch what I do now. And if you don't have a Bible, you want a Bible, you don't know anything about early Christianity, if you get a Bible, the first book in the Bible, when you open it up, maybe it's intuitive, is a book called Genesis, which can mean beginnings, right? It just begins really with this explosive, some of you get the punch in the face. But you're like, what's happening in this story? Like you're like, all of these things are about to happen. And art is one of these great gifts that we have that kind of tries to capture that. If you walk by and that's lit up a bit more and just look at it and you're like, wow. Like this is like just our brain trying to capture the beauty, the majesty, the glory of God. Says, I am the God who creates. I am the God that gives life to all things. I am that God. And we're left now like, okay, then what does that mean for me? Like, how do I live in that story if that's true? And the beginning of the Bible, this is how it begins. I'm going to read it for you. If you have a Bible, you can follow along, or you'll see it on the screen behind me. Right, the beginning of Genesis chapter 1, just right at the beginning, let me read this for you. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. How beautiful. I mean, you read it, you might want to go home and look at the page, you're like, this is beautiful. This is how the story begins. Now I want to tell you a few things that if you're reading this or you know the story for a while, like you might be like, what? What's next? You need to know a few important things. And so it's going to start to get a little bit heavy. So I need you to stay with me, thinking. You might want to write some things. So the word here that we have, when it says in the beginning God created, the word created is a Hebrew word. The word is bara. Everyone say bara. Bara is a Hebrew word. Now you might not get this in English, but the word bara, it's a verb, someone creating, an action word, that almost all the time in the Hebrew Bible is only connected to when God creates. Meaning no other humans create like this. Now in English, we might just use create, and you won't see that it's like, wait, this is a different word. The word bara, all of the people who are hearing it in Hebrew know, wait a second, when God creates, it's going to be different than when other things happen and are created. When humans create, or when humans make things, there's another Hebrew word, which tips you off that this is different than when God creates. Okay? So the word bara is to introduce us to this idea that what God is about to do now, you've never seen and you really can't do. It's really, really special. And one of the things that happens when we read the story, we're caught in this tension about how do we read this story? Like, you meet people who read about the Bible. I don't know if you know people like this. They're trying to figure out, like, is this literal? Is this about symbols? Is it all kinds of things? And you right away, you read it, and you're like, the earth is formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. You're like, there's nothing there. The Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. How many of you caught that? Right away. You're like, wait a second. Why is there water here? I thought there was nothing, and now the Spirit is hovering over the waters? I'm confused. Everybody stop. How many feel a bit confused when you start to see stuff like that and you're like, wait a second, you tried to trick me, You should feel confused. If you don't feel confused, you're really not reading it properly. You should feel like, wait, if everything's empty, why is there water? What does that even mean? That there's water already there? It's meant for the writers to invite us into a story that we will never fully understand. That's why art is so powerful. Because art brings us into the mystery of a story where we can live with the truth and yet be like, but there's parts of it that are just beyond me, I don't know. Part of why we worship God and people don't worship us, get it? So it's this idea that this is way beyond us. Now I want to tell you, like, there's an elephant in the room for many people. Like years ago, I was pastoring at a university church and we were teaching about Genesis, creation, Christianity, and the dreaded E word came up. Any of you know the dreaded E word? Right? What is it? Evolution. Wow, there you go. The word, right? And some parents wanted to talk to me about their son who was in university, who was attending our church. I said, sure. And they were like upset and tense, and they said, we need to talk to you about this. And I said, sure, what's wrong? They said, well, our son has been coming to this church for X amount of time. And I said, yeah, no problem. And you know what? He still tells us that maybe he believes in evolution. And I said, okay, what am I supposed to do? They're like, well, tell him not, that it's wrong. I'm like, well, that's not what we did in the context of our community. Like, we weren't here. This is university students, by the way. They're asking all kinds of questions. And I was really struck by the fact that I'm like, how do you help people hold on to their question, but live in maybe a bigger question that's happening also in the background of the story? And I said to the parents, there's books I can recommend. There's different Christians who have different perspectives on this. But let's not get lost with that question and miss the deeper meaning of the story. So can I just give you something really, really important? That before the book of Genesis becomes about how we showed up and how we're special, right? Because that's the question, right? Well, I want to know that I didn't come from some monkey, right? I want to know how I'm special. Before you get to that question, you first have to live in this question. God's about to tell you why he's special. Right. And so many people want to live in the tension of why they're special without ever feeling the tension of why God is special. Because once you understand why God is special, which is, by the way, the primary question of the text, then you're like, you know what, I just realized this story is not even about me. And you get mad, right? You're like, oh, it's about me. And God's like, this story's not about you at all, it's about me. Learn to surrender yourself to my story first. And God's about to show his people in this creation story that he's like no other God. And you know how, we just know from the beginning when you read it, you know how God creates? Does he get tools? Does he like talk to people? God creates by speaking. Like, how do you even study that? He just speaks. So already even the rabbinic teachers would say, this is such a new way of thinking about creation. That God just speaks things and they exist. No, I can't do that. Try it. Try it now. What have you tried? Like, make something appear here. What would you like to see here? A bus? Just say it. Let there be a... Okay, do it again. You didn't do it good. If you do it good enough, it's going to show up. All of you think it's like a joke. It should be a joke because none of us can create by speaking. And then it says that not only does God speak things, we're like, okay, how are we going to figure that out? Is that? Then he says he sees what he's created and he says, oh, this is good. Now this should really also throw you off because God doesn't have eyes. The Bible's very clear that God is spirit. So you're reading, you're like, God's seeing this. What are the rabbinic teachers trying to teach us? Like, what is this? They're trying to teach you that the God who creates everything is like no other God. And the prophets are going to constantly remind them, hey, before you figure out how you fit in the story, just you need to understand first, this is God's story. This is about how God is different, not just about how you're different. The prophet Isaiah has this great quote. This is what he says. I'm going to read it for you. He says this in the book of Isaiah to talk about this story. He's one of the great Jewish prophets. He says, for this is what the Lord says. He who created the heavens, he is God. He has fashioned them and made the earth. He founded it. He did not create it to be empty, but formed it to be inhabited. And he says, I am the Lord and there is no other. This is the great reminder, the lens of interpretation. Look at how many different words are used in the Hebrew for creating, forming, shaping, making. You're like, how do you even hold all this together? God's like, don't worry about it. I'm holding all of this together, and you need to understand that I have this story that you've been invited into. Do you want to be part of that story? I struggled my whole life wanting to be part of that story. I wanted a story where I was the center. I wanted a story where I got to decide how things work. And you read the Bible and God's like, well, if you really want to know who you are, you have to be okay with being part of this story. The story of which I am the creator, the living force of everything. And I hold it all together, and even as you try to study me, and you should worship me because you'll never understand this in its fullness. Do you want that story? Do you want to live in the truth of that story? Constantly we're invited to either, because if we don't learn to live in that story, this is what will happen. You will have to pick another story to live in. How many of you know somebody who's an atheist and who just doesn't believe in God at all? How many of you? If you don't put your hand up, I always say this, you got to get more friends. Just go have coffee with your neighbor, right? That's a story. There's another story for how people believe in the world. How many know somebody, they're really edgy, they believe that creation is connected to the aliens? How many of you know somebody like that? I know one person trying to unfriend them, it's not working, okay? If you're watching, I love you. Okay, so it's always a little bit like aliens and humans. I'm like, that's kind of weird. I don't know what you're talking about, right? There's all kinds of options for stories about why we're here and how this works. Like, and if you don't believe me, there's a whole encyclopedia called Creation Stories of the Ancient World. Like, you're like, what? Just when you thought our little evolutionary tension story was weird, just read about the kinds of stories in the Bible that people are wrestling with. People who love Jesus and are following God and are like, we kind of have heard a lot of different stories about who you are, God, and about what this is about. Now, you might not remember this, but the Jewish people who are living in this passage in Genesis and Isaiah have come from Egypt. The Egyptians were one of the dominant cultures that gave people stories to live in, right? And one of the great stories that the Egyptians love to tell is that their God is above all other gods. Okay? If you ever watch The Mummy, the movie The Mummy, watch it, it's kind of interesting. Weird. Like the Egyptian god, his name was Ra, sometimes it's called Amun-Ra, is the god of supreme energy, and he's the god of light. Okay? So imagine that story, and then the Jewish people are like, in the beginning was God, and God is going to create light. Right away, the Egyptians are like, wait a second, that's not how it works. We'll tell you the story you're going to live in. God's like, no, that's not the story that my people are going to hold on to. They're going to have a different story to live in. And so I just want to show you how weird this is. When you have all these other stories, think about your life. Think about the many things you believe in as it relates to why you're here. Why are you here? Your kids ask you, why am I here? What story will you give them? What story will you say, hey, this is the story we live in? And I have questions about this. Beautiful. What story will you invite them to walk into? Well, if you don't have one, the world will give them one. The Egyptians had one for everybody. And if you really were serious, you obeyed that story. And the Egyptians had this complicated system for creation and gods. So I just have a little graph for you. I just want to show you this. You can go to the picture. It's a little makeshift picture from a book, okay? This is how the Egyptian world gave people a story of the living God. There's the great God at the top, the sun God, his name is Ra. He has two other created beings that flow out of him, and how these beings flow out of him it's so weird. Like, you try to read about it and explain it, it's weird. So here's the simple version of it. Is that there's this orgasmic, almost sexual experience that the God Ra has, and out of that is birth these two other gods. Now imagine your kids coming home from school and telling you they learned that story. How many of you be like, we're changing school, this is crazy, right? We think we're the only ones that have people that we live with that have a different story of creation. Everybody in the Bible is living with the complexity of like, we know how creation works, and we've been with the Egyptians, and this is the story, right? And so there's this pyramid of gods and gods and gods, and here's the best part. Humans show up in the Egyptian story when Ra looks at the stuff underneath him and begins to weep. And the tears of Ra create mortals. That's a story that people in the ancient world knew about how this all happened. And yet, the Bible says in the beginning, God created. And he begins to create things and unfold things. And I want to encourage you this week, even as we go through, just go read through the first few chapters of Genesis. Live in the questions and the doubt and the mystery, and it's like the beauty of it all. And as you read it, I want to just give you a pattern that's so different than all the other things that people talked about and that maybe you believe. That when the Bible talks about God creating us, he said it was very good. Our God didn't create by weeping, by being sad, by being overwhelmed. The Jewish people were about to learn that the living God wants creation to be part of what he's creating, and he looks at it and is like, wow, it's beautiful, right? Look at this. Look how beautiful this is. Like, he invited us into this story that he's creating, and he says, not only by mistake, not only did you fall into this story, not only am I regretting there's mortals now. Oh, mortals. What do we do with them? None of that, which is very common in all the other stories. It was like this moment of like, wow, they will be the height of my glory, these humans, as they live out of the truth that I am a living God and that they are living beings because they get their life from me. See how different that story is? This week, as you think about your life, as you go through your struggles, ups and downs, to remind yourself to say, God, I don't feel living today. I don't even feel like I want to go to work. I don't know if I'm doing good as a parent, but I need to be reminded that somehow the living life that comes from you is going to sustain me and teach me to live in this story about who I'm meant to be. This is one of the most essential things that the people in the Bible are wrestling with and trying to learn. Now, I want to take a quick pause. I want you all to take a deep breath. Okay, deep breath right now. And next thing I'm going to tell you is going to be very hard to understand. Okay? So if you have to stretch, whatever, I just want to prepare you. If we stop the story here, all of us can be Jewish. Right? It's a beautiful Jewish story. The Jewish people love this. If we stop the story here, we can even almost be Muslim. To say creation, loving God, cares. I mean, there's some nuances of the story. The thing that's about to rock everybody's world is how Christians will start to see something else in this story. They'll start to realize that something else is going on that I don't think we've ever seen before. So I want to give you two words that whenever you look at that painting, you will never forget. Okay, you ready for them? That creation is always connected to covenant. Say that again. Creation is always connected to a covenant. Always. That's what makes God creating us and saying it's good, and that we're made in His image because we are covenantal people. A covenant is a word that we don't use today because we live by a story, which is we make contracts with each other. But the Bible's word for this is that God loves His creation so much that He makes promises with His creation, and that's a covenantal relationship. Saying that every time you see everything around you, and you wonder how you fit in all of it, remember that you've been created to need to have relational trust and covenants with people. Now, I know many people don't believe that. Our kids and young adults and people who live in our culture and you live in our world believe that covenants don't matter. You know what matters? Just somebody liking someone else. Or someone lusting after someone else. You know how hard it is to tell people who are struggling with sexuality in our culture, crazy sexuality culture, to say, listen, you shouldn't be really intimate with someone unless you make what with them? A covenant. Because there's something about a covenant that protects the trust of the story we're a part of. Right? You need to understand that we are created first and foremost to be in a covenant, and then out of that covenant everything flourishes. You know why? Because that's what God is like. So far so good? Do you get that? And you see how easy, there's another story that says covenants don't matter. They don't matter. God's like, no, they do matter. In this story, they really matter. If you violate this covenant, you will be burned. If you violate and ignore this covenantal way of life, you will start to feel your life being in disorder. Okay, but then here's the moment of all moments. Why does God create us as those who are covenantal in a relationship with Him? Why does this happen? I'm going to read you the passage and some of you are going to get it. Ready? I'm just curious if some of you get it. This is why. In John's Gospel, all the way in the New Testament, at the beginning of John's Gospel, John will say, let's talk about creation again. And this is what he'll say. In the beginning was the Word, which circle you could put Jesus. And the Word was with God. And the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Where have you read that before? Well, Genesis talks like this. Through Him, all things were made. Without Him, nothing was made that has been made. And in Him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. Okay, let's practice. I'm going to explain to you what that means, and all of you are going to do this, okay? You're going to be like, whoa. Ready? Try. Whoa. Okay, you didn't get it. Somebody just woke up. Ready? Say, whoa. Whoa. Ready for this? I'm going to tell you, and then remember, we're going to cue it. Ready? God says, for you to understand how I'm different from every other God, you have to understand that I myself am in a covenantal relationship already. Whoa. Huh? You feel that? He's like, you know that before even creation happened, I, the Spirit, and the Son are already in a covenant of a loving relationship with each other. You need to know that in the beginning, it's not just God. In the beginning, the Son is also there with God. And the Spirit. And all the people who hear this say, whoa. Exactly. Do you see how the story, we haven't even started talking about us. God's like, you have to know how I'm different than every other God. Whoa, is it right? There's wisdom. That's wisdom there, right? All of a sudden we go from like, the Jewish people have a creation story, and the Muslim people have a creation story, and other people have a creation story, and Christians show up and they're like, by the way, those are nice, but this is the story of covenantal love that God gives us. That the Trinitarian life force of God Almighty is there from the beginning, and Jesus is already there. He's there. You have to know this story. This is one of the pillars that you have to put down in the sand and say all the fences, all the things you have to stick to this pole. They have to hold on this pole. That when we say yes to Jesus, we're saying we believe that we're part of a story that requires us to be covenantal people. People who keep our word because the God who created us is a God who speaks and things happen. Our words matter, how we live matter, how we're in relationship with each other. The covenants we make not only in marriage, but in just relationships matter. We try to help you with this as a church all the time, to realize this. We've invited you to come to a ministry partner meeting that's about a covenant you make with a church. Most of you are not going to be there. It's too tense? It's too much? Because you're like, I don't really want to make a covenant. Like, who cares? Like, oh, we'll just come and whatever, if it works. My kids like the youth, whatever. And we're saying, no, there's something about covenanting in a deeper way that says, no, this is serious now. We're going to do this. Why? Because that's God's very nature. And the God who's the living God, He created us with that in us as well. Because we are made in His image. that we need covenantal relationships to live as the people of the living God. Do you feel that? All of us should be like, wow. Everything in me says, like, I don't want to be committed to anything. I want to do what I want. What's that story? The individualistic story. I do what I want when I want. Who cares? And you try it for a bit and you realize, why am I not happy? Why do I not know what's going on? We're going to celebrate communion in a second. I'm going to have the team come back up. And I want to remind you that one of the things that Jesus will say at this table, he's going to tell his disciples that God the Father, through this meal, is making what? A new covenant with us. Now, if you don't know the story of God, if you don't know how this all fits in, you're like, what does that even mean? Covenant is such a weird word. I don't use it with anyone else. Jesus is like, well, don't you know the story of creation? Don't you know that John told you that I was there from all, like it was me? That just when you thought that your mistakes and your challenges and all the things you regret, just when you thought that they kind of separated you from God so that the covenant is broken, Jesus is like, God always keeps his promises. When you submit your life to his story, he always keeps his promises, even when you break yours. Even when you walk away from the story, he's there and he's like, I'm the covenant creating, living God. There is no other God like me. And those who follow me live in that story. Because the story is first and foremost about him. And there is no other God like him. So this morning, I'm going to ask you to think about the many stories you've believed about your life. You maybe didn't even realize it. You're like, I thought I believed in God, but I don't think I live in this covenantal relational story. I don't think I understood that. I was busy asking other questions, and those questions matter. But this morning, as we take some time, and I'll explain it in a minute, and you come to this table, you have to understand that Jesus says, I'm the only one that can heal this covenantal relationship. I'm the only one that can make this whole now. Because everything about creation is built on that pillar that God made a covenant with you. And next week you want to be here, we're going to talk about the violation of that covenant, the brokenness. It's the next panel. It's juicy. But this morning we're going to have to just get honest and say, God, I believed a lot of different stories. And I've lived in stories, and I've tried to find my place in the story, and I tried to figure out why I'm here and how do I fit in. And God's like, listen, you'll only really answer those questions when you realize you're here for my story, I'm not here for yours. And if you can say yes to that, if you're finally tired of living your story, just come. Come to the table and let Jesus begin to heal you and give you what it looks like to be part of this new covenant that's been done in his blood, which I'll read in a few minutes. We're going to sing a song. This is an old school song. I thought about it last night as I was praying and preparing, and I called Dave. I'm like, bro, last minute, I just feel like I want to do this song. This is old school. If you don't know it, and if you're new here, just let it just sing over you about the kind of story that we live in. Let's sing it together before we take communion together.